¿Ya arreglé mi auto?
Es el Studebaker. ¿Sabes el que tiene el perrito en la ventana que dice...
Carol Burnett has spent close to 7 decades making the world laugh. She has fallen through trapdoors, screamed like Tarzan on national television, and turned pratfalls into an art form. But somewhere inside that enormous body of work sits one single performance that she has almost never talked about revisiting. A quiet, aching few minutes from 1977 in which the funniest woman in America stopped being funny at all. To understand why that moment landed so hard, and why it still seems to sit apart from everything else she ever filmed, you have to go back to the beginning, long before the studio audience, long before the Emmys, back to a little girl in San Antonio who was already learning that laughter could be armor. Carol Burnett was born on April 26, 1933, in San Antonio, Texas, into a household that was unstable almost from her first memory. Her parents, Joseph and Ina, both struggled with alcoholism, and neither one was equipped to give a young child the steadiness she needed. Her father drifted between jobs, including work at a movie theater, never quite able to hold on to any of them for long. Her mother wanted to be a writer, but never found her footing, and the drinking swallowed whatever ambitions either of them once had. Both would eventually die of illnesses tied to alcohol. Long before Carol understood what alcoholism even was, she understood what it felt like to be a child whose parents were present in the house but absent from her life. It was her grandmother, Mabel White, who became her actual home. In 1940, Mabel packed up 7-year-old Carol and moved them from Texas to Hollywood, chasing the promise of something better. What they found instead was a tiny one-room apartment in a rundown boarding house on Wilcox Avenue, in a stretch of the city far from the glamour the name Hollywood implied. The building was full of people just barely getting by, men and women on public assistance, drifters, people nursing their own private disappointments. Carol and her grandmother lived on very little money, but Mabel gave her something the girl had never fully had before, the sense that someone showed up for her every single day, without condition. In that cramped, uncertain world, Carol built herself an escape hatch. She invented an imaginary twin named Karen, glamorous, confident, endlessly charming, everything Carol felt she wasn't. She would slip up the fire escape, change her look, and come back down as Karen, flirtatious and bright, fooling neighbors who really did believe, at least for a while, that this other girl existed. It was a strange kind of performance for a child to give, night after night, to an audience of struggling adults who probably needed the illusion as much as she did. The other great escape was the movies. Nearly every Saturday, grandmother and granddaughter would scrape together a quarter for 2 tickets and disappear into a darkened theater for a few hours. On screen, the world had order and beauty and endings that made sense. Back at the apartment, money was so tight that the household sometimes did without basic necessities, and Carol has said plainly in later interviews that they were poor enough to be, in her words, on relief. It was in one of those darkened theaters that she first heard Johnny Weissmuller's Tarzan yell rattle through the speakers, and something about it lodged in her. She practiced it obsessively at home, chasing the pitch and the breath control without any idea that she was training a voice that would one day bring down the house on network television. By the time she finished high school, Carol's plan wasn't comedy at all. It was journalism, a dream she'd more or less inherited from her mother's unfulfilled ambitions. She set her sights on UCLA, but tuition, even at the modest rate of the era, was more than she could scrape together. According to the story Burnett has told for decades in interviews and in her own memoirs, an anonymous stranger quietly covered the cost, asking for nothing in return except that she pay the kindness forward one day. It's the kind of detail that sounds almost too good to be true, and yet it's one she has repeated unprompted throughout her life, crediting it as the reason her story didn't end in that Hollywood boarding house. Once she was on campus, journalism didn't last. She has explained that UCLA didn't actually offer a journalism major, so she gravitated toward theater arts instead, and, in her freshman year, an acting class changed everything. She has recalled picking a scene she thought would be light and getting real laughter from her classmates, and describing the feeling of that laughter as something she simply wanted more of. It's a small, ordinary campus memory, But it marks the exact point where a girl who had spent her childhood hiding behind an invented twin found out she didn't need to hide at all. She could just get up and be funny, in front of people, as herself. Money remained the obstacle standing between Carol and any real career. As she has told the story over the years, a couple she met while working a catering job offered to help pay her way to New York, on the condition that she never reveal their identity and that she pass the favor along to someone else someday. Whether or not every detail of that account has been retold with a storyteller's polish over 60 years of interviews, the broad shape of it, a young woman with nothing, helped by strangers who wanted no credit, recurs throughout Burnett's own retellings of her early life, and it set her on a plane east with almost nothing but nerve. New York was not kind at first. She lived at the Rehearsal Club, a boarding house for young women trying to break into the arts, sharing a room and a bathroom with strangers while she auditioned by day and checked hats at a nightclub by night. Her break, when it finally came, was almost accidental. A joke song about the very stiff, very serious Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, written by Ken Welch, that Carol performed with such committed sincerity that it became a sensation. It carried her onto the Jack Paar Show and then, in January 1957, onto the Ed Sullivan Show, where a shaking, nervous young woman turned into a performer the whole country suddenly wanted to see more of. From there, her career built steadily rather than exploding overnight. Small television roles led to a breakout stage performance in 1959 as the boisterous Princess Winifred in Once Upon a Mattress, which earned her a Tony nomination and made her a genuine Broadway name. 3 years on The Gary Moore Show sharpened her comic instincts and taught her the value of unscripted, in-the-moment interaction with a live audience, a lesson she would carry directly into her own show. In 1962, a television special with Julie Andrews, filmed at Carnegie Hall, won major awards and confirmed what people in the industry already suspected. Carol Burnett could hold a stage entirely on her own terms. Then, on September 11, 1967, The Carol Burnett Show premiered on CBS, and for 11 seasons it became appointment television for tens of millions of households. It was one of the last great old-fashioned variety shows, built around live comedy sketches performed in front of a studio audience, unrehearsed Q&A sessions where Carol simply took questions before the show began, and a company of performers, Harvey Korman, Vicki Lawrence, Lyle Waggoner, and later Tim Conway, who became as beloved as she was. Over its run, the show collected 25 Primetime Emmy Awards, and Time magazine would later count it among the greatest television programs ever made. Among all the show's recurring bits, one mattered to Burnett more than almost any other. A sketch called The Family, built around a miserable, squabbling household made up of the sharp-tongued Eunice Higgins, her long-suffering husband Ed, and her domineering mother, Thelma Mama Harper. The sketch first appeared in the 1973-74 season and went on to run for the remainder of the show's history, eventually spinning off into a television movie and the sitcom Mama's Family. In a resurfaced 1995 interview with Katie Couric, Burnett named Eunice as her favorite character she ever played, explaining that the woman started out simply hateful before the writing let audiences understand where all that rage actually came from, a mother who felt trapped and who nursed absurd, hopeless dreams of being somebody bigger than the life she'd been handed. Those dreams collided head-on with reality in a family sketch that aired on February 12, 1977. In which Eunice finally gets her long-awaited shot at stardom by entering herself as a contestant on the wildly popular amateur talent show The Gong Show. The real host of that program, Chuck Barris, appeared as himself alongside real celebrity panelists Jamie Farr, J.P. Morgan, and Alan Ludden. Eunice steps out and sings her own version of the song Feelings, pouring every unmet hope of her small, disappointing life into it. And the judges gong her off the stage almost as soon as she's begun. There is no punchline rescuing the moment. The camera holds on Burnett's face as Eunice's humiliation registers in real time. And for a few uncomfortable seconds, one of the most reliably hilarious shows on American television simply lets its star sit in unglamorous, unresolved pain. Burnett has talked about that sketch with unusual specificity for someone who filmed literally thousands of scenes across her career. In a 2010 interview promoting her memoir This Time Together, She described the response it drew from viewers, recalling that the sketch was so sad it brought in fan mail from people who said it had made them cry, and calling it, in her own words, a heavy piece. That's a striking admission from a performer whose stated mission, over and over across decades of interviews, was to make people forget their troubles rather than remind them of their own. She has said plainly that she never wanted to hurt anyone or chase an edgy laugh at the expense of real, uncomplicated joy. And yet here was a sketch, embedded right in the middle of her cheerful variety hour, that did something closer to quiet devastation. It isn't difficult to understand why the material sat so close to the bone for her. Eunice was a woman defined by a childhood short on stability, a fractured relationship with her mother, and a desperate, half-embarrassing hope that talent alone might be enough to lift her out of an ordinary, disappointing life. Burnett has never shied away from acknowledging that her own childhood carried real versions of all three of those things: the alcoholic parents, the poverty, the sense of a girl looking for any door that might lead somewhere better. She wasn't simply performing a comic archetype in that Gong Show sketch. She was standing in front of a live studio audience and tens of millions of viewers at home, inside a version of exact fear that had once haunted a hungry 7-year-old sneaking into movie theaters with her grandmother. The fear of reaching for something and being publicly, humiliatingly told no. That is likely why, across the decade since, Burnett has circled back to that particular sketch far more often and far more seriously than she has to almost any other single moment from an 11-year, 279-episode run, where she speaks about most of her old sketches with the breezy, delighted nostalgia of someone flipping through a favorite photo album. Her tone shifts noticeably when the Gong Show sketch comes up. The jokes fall away, and what's left is something closer to respect for how much it actually cost her to play it. It is one thing to put on a wig and fall down a flight of stairs for a laugh. It is another thing entirely to let millions of strangers watch your face while you perform the specific, private ache of being laughed at for wanting more than you were ever supposed to have. The rest of Burnett's career suggests that this kind of raw vulnerability was the exception in her work, not the rule, which may be exactly why the sketch still stands out so sharply. In 1997, she won an Emmy for a comparatively gentle, grounded guest turn on Mad About You. In 2008, she lent her voice to the animated hit Horton, Here's a Who. In 2022, she returned to Broadway-adjacent material and to a career-spanning run of specials and guest appearances that never really slowed down. Remarkably, at 89 years old, she appeared in the final season of Better Call Saul as the sharp, quietly formidable Marion, a performance built on stillness and control rather than physical comedy, proving her range had only deepened with age. 2 years later, at 91, she earned an Emmy nomination for playing a woman waking from a coma on Apple TV+'s Palm Royale, making her the oldest female acting nominee in the award's history. Across all of it, audiences kept discovering and rediscovering that the woman behind the Tarzan yell and the ear tug had always had far more depth than the broad comedy ever fully revealed. Off camera, Burnett's life carried its own share of hardship that mirrored, in some ways, the pain she once channeled into Eunice. She weathered 2 divorces, a very public and successful lawsuit against a tabloid that had printed false claims about her, and most painfully, her eldest daughter Carrie's years-long struggle with addiction as a teenager in the late 1970s, followed decades later by Carrie's death from cancer in 2002, at just 38. Burnett has spoken about all of these chapters with striking candor in her books and interviews, treating them as part of a life that was never as tidy or as easily resolved as her television persona might have suggested. Given how openly she has discussed grief, addiction in her family, and public humiliation by the press, her comparative reluctance to dwell on one 5-minute comedy sketch says something. It suggests that the discomfort isn't really about privacy at all. It's about proximity. The other hardships happened to her. The Gong Show sketch asked her to perform hers on command under studio lights for an audience expecting to laugh. What makes the sketch endure nearly 50 years later isn't really the premise. A housewife bombing on a talent show is, on paper, a fairly simple comic setup. What makes it endure is the split second where Carol Burnett let the mask slip, where a woman famous for pratfalls and physical comedy chose stillness instead and let an audience see something true. It's a reminder that the performers who make us laugh the hardest are very often carrying something heavier just beneath the surface, and that the bravest thing they ever do on screen isn't always the pratfall. Sometimes it's the moment they stop clowning entirely and simply let us see them. Carol Burnett built a career on convincing generations of viewers that laughter could fix almost anything. In 4 Minutes on a February Night in 1977, she also showed them, quietly and without a single joke, exactly what laughter had always been protecting her from.